On a cold winter morning in 1986, two massive steel giants raced towards each other on a single track, unaware that they were about to create one of the most devastating railway disasters in Canadian history. 23 lives would be lost in mere seconds. This is the story of the Hinton Train Collision, one of Canada's deadliest rail disasters. What went so terribly wrong? Could this tragedy have been prevented? Before we dive into the background of this disaster documentary, I invite you to subscribe this channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our train disaster documentaries. Hinton is a small town in southwestern Canada with a population of about 9,800 as of 2016. It's located in Alberta, a province in Canada, about 158 miles west of Edmonton, the provincial capital, and 221 miles east of Prince George. Hinton is located along Alberta Highway 16, part of the Yellowhead Highway that stretches across Canada from Masset, British Columbia, to Winnipeg, Manitoba. The town is also served by the Canadian National Railway, CN, which operates a flag stop at Hinton Station for the Canadian train, meaning it only stops if a request is made 48 hours in advance. In the 1980s, Hinton was a stop for Via Rail Supercontinental, a passenger train that traveled across Canada from Montreal to Vancouver. Just east of Hinton, the railway changes from a single track to two tracks near the Obed Summit Rest area on Highway 16. The first train involved in the crash was the Via Rail Supercontinental, traveling east from Jasper to Edmonton. At Jasper, the Skeena, another Via Rail passenger service, was added to the back of the train, including its locomotive. The train was led by EMD-FP7 number 6566, a powerful four-axle diesel locomotive introduced in 1949. Its supercharged V16 diesel engine, which produced 1,500 horsepower. Behind locomotive number 6566 was EMD-F9B number 6633, a cableless B unit designed to boost power. B units, or boosters, are controlled remotely from the lead locomotive, eliminating the need for an additional crew. The Skeena train included a locomotive as its eighth car, but its engine was turned off, and it was being towed. On the day of the accident, this locomotive was a GMD-FP9ARM with the number 6300. It was an upgraded version of the GMD-FP9A, made specifically for Via Rail. The FP9ARM was introduced in 1983 and had new engines and electrical systems. The passenger train, operating as number 4, had 9 passenger cars and 2 steam generator cars for heating. It was carrying 94 passengers and a crew of 21, including the locomotive crew. At the time of the accident, the train was driven by engineers Pelishati, 57, and Miller, 53. The number 6300 locomotive had no crew on board and was essentially being treated as a regular train car. The second train involved in the crash was CN Freight Train number 413, which consisted of 3 locomotives and 115 freight cars, mostly carrying grain. The freight train was led by EMD-GP 382W number 5586, a Canadian version of the EMD-GP 382. It was designed with a Canadian comfort cab, which means the front nose is wider. This wider nose provides extra protection in case of accidents with smaller obstacles like stopped cars or fallen trees. It also gives a bit more space inside the cabin for comfort. Behind the lead locomotive number 5586 were 2 EMD SD40s, numbered 5104 and 5062. The EMD SD40 is a 6-axle diesel freight locomotive introduced in 1966, designed for both freight hauling and shunting. The train was operated by engineer Hudson, 48 years old, with brakeman Edwards, 25 years old, accompanying him. At the rear of the train, in the caboose, was the conductor, Mr. Smith, 33 years old, a required crew member for freight trains at the time. On February 8, 1986, at around 8 a.m., the freight train was stopped at a siding near Medicine Lodge, 15 miles east of Hinton, to allow 2 eastbound trains to pass on the single-track section. The freight train left Medicine Lodge at 8:02 a.m. and reached the end of the double track section at Hargwin at 8:20 a.m., where it was directed onto the northern track. At the same time, the Supercontinental departed Hinton, 5 minutes behind schedule, heading east. At 8:29 a.m., the dispatcher set the points at the western end of the double track section for the southern track, which turned the exit signal for the northern track red. Located 150 meters before the end of the double track, the signal now showed 3 solid red lights for the freight train, indicating that it must stop. For trains traveling east to west, like the freight train, there was a red signal that had been preceded by an approach signal 2.5 miles earlier. This signal showed yellow over red, meaning expect stop. It told the freight train to slow down to 30 miles per hour and get ready to stop at the next signal. As the freight train approached the first signal, Conductor Smith tried to radio the locomotive using mileboards to estimate their location. After several attempts with no response, he assumed the radio was faulty. He thought everything was fine, estimating the train was traveling at around 50 miles per hour and feeling like the brakes had been applied slightly. However, both estimates were wrong. Smith could have checked the air pressure gauges for the brakes, but he trusted his instincts and his colleagues, so he didn't. For unknown reasons, the crew either became distracted or unable to act as they approached the signal. The train passed the approach signal at 59 miles per hour, which was 9 miles per hour faster than the allowed speed if the signal had been green. The investigation found no signs that the brakes had been applied. After running the approach signal, the freight train also ran the main signal without slowing down, breaking the points, passing through a set of points that weren't set for their direction, and entered the single-track section right in front of the passenger train. 2 passengers on the passenger train saw the lights of the oncoming freight train. Mr. Warniski, in car 4, realized they were on the same track and shouted out just moments before the collision. At 8:40 a.m., just 18 seconds after the freight train broke the points, the 2 trains collided head-on at a combined speed of 108 miles per hour. The collision destroyed both leading locomotives, killing the crews instantly, and derailed the train cars behind them. On the freight train, the first 76 freight cars and the 3 locomotives were either destroyed or severely damaged. The passenger train's forward section, ahead of locomotive number 6300, derailed and collided with the wreckage. The leading passenger car was crushed by a freight car, while the second car suffered severe damage as it ran into the stationary locomotives. The dome car, which had an elevated glass dome for better views, derailed and almost tipped over. Several survivors were able to escape through the broken windows in the dome and jump to safety, leaving the train behind. 2 passenger cars behind the dome car were thrown to the side, causing serious injuries to some people but no deaths, as they were thrown clear of the wreckage. The rear passenger cars didn't derail, but the violent stop caused injuries to the passengers. At the moment of impact, the locomotive's fuel tanks ruptured, sparking a massive fireball that engulfed the locomotives, the baggage car, and the leading passenger car. As the grain-filled hoppers piled up, their cargo spilled over the wreckage, some of it landing inside the torn-open leading passenger car. The spilled grain helped smother the flames, allowing a few survivors to escape. In just seconds, 23 people lost their lives in a violent, forceful event. Among the dead were both locomotive crews and 18 passengers in the leading passenger car, which was in the 4th position behind the baggage car and locomotives. 71 people were injured in what remains Canada's worst railway accident since 1947. Despite the severity of the crash, the report highlights that the number of survivors was notably high, indicating acts of bravery among them. Many survivors helped each other, showing remarkable courage instead of fleeing the wreckage immediately. Moments after the collision, but before the freight train stopped moving, Smith saw a fireball in the distance. He immediately warned the locomotive crew and then decided to jump off the caboose after grabbing a radio and important documents. He was worried that the caboose, along with cars carrying dangerous cargo, like caustic soda and ethylene dichloride, would run into the fire. Unable to reach the locomotive crew on the gray radio, used for communication between trains, Smith continued running after the slowing freight train. He then heard a call come in on the red radio, used by dispatch. Climbing onto the caboose as it came to a stop, he picked up the radio. In the brief conversation, he told the dispatcher that something had gone wrong up the train. He said the train had derailed and that he saw a big explosion about 40 cars ahead. Smith told dispatch that he couldn't reach the locomotive crew, but didn't want to go up the train due to the smoke and fumes from the fire, which he still thought was between him and the locomotive. After the conversation, with dispatch notifying emergency services, Smith began moving up the train to check on the 20 cars carrying dangerous goods. Luckily, those cars were near the back of the train. While some had suffered minor damage from the sudden stop, none had derailed or lost their cargo. After hearing this, dispatch ordered the engineer of a following train to park his train, detach from it, and drive up to the crash site. The engineer's job was to pull the cars that hadn't derailed or been damaged too badly, including the dangerous goods cars back from the wreckage. However, they didn't realize that the points at the end of the double-track section had been damaged by the freight train. As a result, one of the freight cars derailed when it was pulled over the points, stopping the operation and further damaging the track. Investigators found no technical issues with the signaling system or the wreckage of the trains. They then examined the bodies of the locomotive crews once recovered. Drugs and alcohol were ruled out as factors. However, it was discovered that Mr. Hudson had a history of heavy smoking and alcoholism. He also suffered from pancreatitis and type 2 diabetes, which put him at higher risk of a heart attack or stroke. While the investigation couldn't prove that one of these conditions caused the accident, it criticized Canadian National Railway, CN, for failing to properly monitor employee health. Given Hudson's known medical conditions, the investigation argued that he should never have been in charge of a mainline freight train. Further interviews with Smith and other employees, including the crew that handed over the freight train to Hudson's crew earlier, revealed deeper issues. Justice Rene P. Foissey, the leader of the Commission of Inquiry, described these problems as part of the railroader culture. The climate at CN focused heavily on loyalty to the company and crew, as well as productivity, often at the cost of safety. Justice Rene P. Foissey highlighted an example of this in Edson Yard, where freight trains were often handed over on the fly. In this practice, one crew would jump off while the train was moving at a slow speed, and the new crew would jump on. This method, while saving time and fuel, was highly negligent and violated safety regulations, which required stationary brake tests after a new crew took over. Despite this clear violation, CN's management claimed to be unaware of the practice, though interviews with employees suggested that it was quite common. With the locomotives destroyed and the crews killed, the investigation had to reconstruct the final moments of the crash. It concluded that the crews of the two trains could have had visual contact just 19 seconds before the collision. This was too late to significantly reduce speed, much less stop the trains. One key question that remained unanswered was why the passenger train didn't apply its brakes, as investigators found that the brakes on the surviving cars were in working order. The investigation then turned to safety systems designed to ensure driver attention, focusing on the dead man's pedal. This pedal, present on both trains, must remain depressed for the train to keep moving. If the engineer releases it, an alarm sounds, followed by an automatic application of the brakes. However, as part of the railroader culture, it was found that many engineers, feeling the task of keeping the pedal depressed was tiresome, would often place a heavy object on the pedal to keep it pressed down, allowing them to use their feet for other tasks. While it's possible that the dead man's pedal issue occurred in the leading freight locomotive, the extensive destruction made it impossible for investigators to inspect the area where the pedal was located or the pedal itself. At the time of the crash, a more advanced safety system, the Reset Safety Control RSC, had already been introduced. This system didn't rely on keeping a pedal depressed. Instead, it required the engineer to perform an action at set intervals, such as pressing a button every few seconds. However, not all of CN's rolling stock had this system at the time of the accident. The EMD SD40 number 5104, the second locomotive on the freight train, did have the RSC, but was placed in the second position. This locomotive lacked the comfort cab, which was a practice at CN and the Union to prioritize the most comfortable locomotives for the front of the train, even if it meant compromising operational safety. Finally, the report criticized the lack of communication between the caboose and the freight train's locomotive. The last communication between Smith, the conductor, and the locomotive crew occurred at Hargwin, which was a significant distance from the site of the crash. The report noted that while the engineer is responsible for operating the locomotive, the conductor is actually the head of the train crew. Therefore, a lack of communication should have alerted Smith to something being wrong. Additionally, Smith faced criticism for failing to trigger an emergency stop after he lost contact with the locomotive crew. Trust and subjective estimations were deemed insufficient for ensuring safe operations. Ultimately, no one was criminally charged in connection with the crash. But the report urged CN to address the widespread negligence within their workforce. It stressed the need for a minimum level of professionalism, particularly among locomotive crews. The exact cause of the incident aboard the freight train was never determined, and the official cause was listed as crew fatigue. Whether the crew became distracted, fell asleep, or experienced some other issue was never fully established. Following the disaster, most of the train cars, except for the rear Skeena section of the passenger train and the rear freight cars, were written off due to extensive damage. The majority of the train cars were either damaged beyond repair or destroyed outright in the collision and subsequent fire. Via Rail's number 6300, the only surviving locomotive was repaired using a cab from a KCS EM-DF7 and remained in service until 2012 when it was donated to a museum. This accident held the record as Canada's worst railway disaster since 1947, until it was overtaken by the Lac-Mégantic rail disaster in 2013. The Lac-Mégantic disaster claimed 47 lives, surpassing both the 1947 accident and the Hinton collision in terms of fatalities. The Hinton collision remains a somber reminder of how, when safety and vigilance slip through the cracks, the consequences can be catastrophic. What happened on that freight train before the disaster? Was it fatigue, negligence, or something else entirely? Despite years of investigation, the truth remains elusive, and we're left to ask, could this have been prevented? We want to hear from you, our viewers. Do you think the cause of this disaster was a result of human error, systemic failure, or both?